Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Okay, happy Thursday everybody. On Tuesday, China announced that it had allowed the Philippines to resupply its Marines stationed on the rusting, intentionally grounded ship, the Sierra Madre, at 2nd Thomas Shoal, what the Chinese call the Ren'ai Reef. The shoal is part of the wider territorial dispute over island features in the region between the two countries. Both claim the feature and the surrounding waters as territorial waters and sovereign territory. China's repeated attempts to block supply missions to the shoal formed part of the Philippines' winning case before the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague in 2014. The tribunal ruled that China's claim, quote, based on ancient maps, is ill-founded, end quote. However, Beijing has rejected the ruling, which it says was unlawful, and maintains that the shoal is its sovereign territory. The last time the Philippines attempted a resupply, China Coast Guard vessels used water cannons to dissuade the efforts. Interestingly, this time the PRC let the resupply happen, so long as they did not deliver any construction materials to shore up the rusting ship. And when I say words like allow and let, I'm using them in the narrowly defined sense of not preventing through force. France-based outlet AFP, at the invitation of the Philippines, sent a team of journalists on board the BRP Cabra, one of the 2 Philippine Coast Guard vessels, and, quote, watched as the Chinese vessels chased, blocked, and corralled the 4 Philippine vessels. One of the Chinese Coast Guard ships came within several meters of the Cabra, end quote. It's worth noting the official language used by the China Coast Guard spokesperson this week. Quote, China Coast Guard on Thursday restricted Philippine vessels trespassing into waters near China's Ren'ai Reef in the South China Sea, but under humanitarian consideration, temporarily allowed the transport of food to the Philippines' grounded warship, end quote. Obviously, the Philippines rejects this, seeing the area as its own territorial waters. It seems that China intends to prevent maintenance and let the ship break apart naturally. As one commentator observed this week, quote, the true test will come when the Philippines tries to deliver construction materials to the vessel. End quote. The reason why China made the decision not to interfere this time may have a more simple explanation, however. After the water cannon incident earlier this month, the US issued a statement on the 5th of August, which included the warning to China, quote, the United States reaffirms an armed attack on Philippine public vessels, aircraft, and armed forces, including those of its Coast Guard in the South China Sea, would invoke U.S. mutual defense commitments under Article 9 of the 1951 U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty. End quote. Next up, the Ministry of State Security, for the second time this month, using its newly launched WeChat account, which we discussed in a previous video, has detailed a case involving an alleged spy that the CIA recruited overseas. To date, the previously highly secretive ministry has published 2 stories, one on a spy reportedly recruited in Italy, the second in Japan. According to the Ministry of State Security story, Hao, the alleged CIA spy, quote, established a connection with Ted, an officer from the U.S. Embassy in Japan, while processing his U.S. visa application during his time studying in Japan. Ted gradually developed a close relationship with Hao by treating him to dinner and presenting gifts. In addition, Ted also asked for Hao's assistance in writing papers, providing a fee in return. Hao agreed to this request. Before the end of his term in the U.S. Embassy in Japan, Ted introduced his colleague Li Jun to Hao. The 2 sides continued to maintain a relationship. Prior to the completion of Hao's studies in Japan, Li Jun clarified his identity as a member of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, in Tokyo, and engaged in the process of recruiting Hao as a spy, requesting Hao work in a critical unit of the Chinese National Ministry upon his return to China. Hao agreed and signed an espionage agreement with the U.S. side and accepted the assessment and training from the U.S. After his studies abroad, Hull returned to China and continued to meet secretly with CIA personnel, providing a large amount of sensitive government information to the US while collecting payment from the CIA. End quote. State-run Global Times, in an editorial the next day, expressed, quote, "Such high-profile revelation of US spying activities shows China has been facing a severe situation of fighting in the hidden battlefront, as the aggressive espionage activities by the US against China are closely related to Washington's current strategy of comprehensive suppression and containment of Beijing. The public needs to remain vigilant against spying activities not only in China, but also in foreign countries, especially among those who study and work abroad for a long time." End quote. The motivation for publishing these stories appears clear. Quote, "These public announcements send a message to PRC citizens overseas to be very careful about contact with any Americans." End quote. Next up, a leading China finance expert argues that China's economy will not pass the US's. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit that like button. It's a huge help for the channel. Sharing, liking, subscribing are all big helps. And as always, anyone who can go the extra mile and help me keep this channel financially sustainable. The channel relies primarily on subscriber support to remain open and free for everyone. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. This week, respected China financial expert at US-based Rhodium Group, Logan Wright, gave testimony before the US-China Economic and Security and Review Commission hearing on China's financial and economic challenges. In his testimony, Wright argues that due to the downturn we have been witnessing these last few years, quote, "Beijing is no longer an economic pacing threat or likely to overtake the United States in any significant measure of economic power in the next 2 decades." End quote. Considering that only 5 years ago the mainstream view was that China certainly would pass the US in economic size, and many still harbour this view, this is a noteworthy position. Wright argues that China's, quote, "still widely underappreciated economic downturn," end quote, reduces the likelihood that it will overtake the US in the next 20 years, and, quote, "gives Washington an opportunity to gain influence over countries that have become indebted to Beijing," end quote. To end today's video, we will examine some of the arguments made by Wright and his recommendations for the US congressional body. The full testimony is quite long, but well worth a read for anyone interested in this topic. I am now quoting Wright directly. "My testimony will focus on 4 topics related to China's structural economic slowdown and its implications for the United States. First and most importantly, I argue that the severity of China's ongoing economic weakness is still widely underappreciated, and that the United States no longer faces a growth challenge from China. Beijing will never be able to make a credible claim to global economic primacy. The challenges that the United States faces in strategic competition with China are highly significant, but they will not be exacerbated by marginal changes in China's economic performance in the years ahead. Second, I discuss Beijing's efforts to downplay public recognition of China's economic slowdown, both inside China and internationally, in order to maintain public messages that China's economic rise is inevitable. Third, I will discuss the importance of the growth of China's financial system in China's economic expansion over the past decade, and why that expansion will not be repeated. China's growth has been exceptional because the expansion of credit in China has been more than exceptional. Fourth and finally, I will argue that the crisis in China's property sector and local governments are interrelated and closely linked to the end of China's unprecedented credit expansion. There is no easy solution for the local debt problem without changing China's entire growth model to make it less dependent upon investment. Here ends the direct quote. Many of these points will be very familiar to regular China Update viewers, of course. On the first of these 4 topics, Wright argued, in part, quote, "China's current economic slowdown is structural in nature. Simply put, most of the factors that contributed to China's rapid growth over the past 2 decades, an expanding labor force, unprecedented credit and growth, a booming property sector, build-up of infrastructure, and a constructive external environment, cannot be repeated in the next decade. Most analysts agree that growth in China will not recover to previous rates, but there is still considerable disagreement about how severe the slowdown will become and the implications of those changes for the United States." End quote. Wright's recommendations to the US congressional body were: 1. US officials and lawmakers should speak candidly about China's economic challenges and the problems of its economic data. 2. Congress should prepare more active steps to extend alternative channels of financial support to emerging economies struggling to renegotiate debts with Beijing. The US should develop trade policy options that facilitate de-risking and supply chain diversification away from China. And 4. Financial decoupling measures are high risk and low return. It's worth unpacking this point. Wright expresses, quote, efforts to drive disinvestment from China offer little benefit to the United States and may damage US pro-market credibility in some areas. Shifting global manufacturing and critical supply chains away from China will already be a costly project in terms of economic efficiency and the need for subsidized investments in some sectors, and decisions to incur these costs should be focused on areas with far greater national security concerns at stake. End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a wonderful Thursday, and I will see you all tomorrow.